Hi, I'm Natasha Sinyanovich, a public radio journalist, and this is Women Like Sex, a myth-busting podcast that examines the many, many medical, scientific, and social facts about female sexuality that were never, in fact, facts. Especially the very modern-day belief that women don't like sex as much as men do. I'll be speaking with experts, educators, friends, comedians, and listeners of all ages, backgrounds, and parts of the globe to flip the scripts on myths and misconceptions that have long been dictated by not women. Together, we'll replace so much inaccurate messaging with healthier, smarter, factual facts and get the sex ed we wished we'd gotten. Welcome to Season 2 of Women Like Sex. I'm so happy to be back. The longer than expected hiatus is due to professional and personal rabbit holes that left no time for this nudge, entirely independent, self-funded podcast. So please visit patreon.com/womenlikesex. But really, podcast seasons are kind of arbitrary. Like New Year's Eve, which feels like a big deal, and then the next day is Tuesday, and life goes on. And like virginity, except that at least we ring in and celebrate the future, and we don't talk about losing the previous year. Of the many myths we're busting on this show, virginity may be the biggest of all. Ask someone to define it, and as with sex itself, they'll likely tell you it involves sticking a penis into a vagina. And some will say you can prove the first time that vagina has been stuck. You cannot. Not through hymens, urine streams, breast shapes, or even blushing, as you're about to hear. Virginity is a social construct. It has no medical or biological definitions whatsoever. None. Zero. Yet the largely religious ideas behind it are deeply ingrained in society, and there are plenty of adults who still believe in, quote, hymen theory. For millennia, humans have tried to prove and control sexual purity in females, and hardly ever in males. But sometimes virginity has given some girls and women a way out of that control, all of which makes sense when you think about it, as my guests have done at length. Historian Anke Bernau teaches at the University of Manchester in the UK and is author of Virgins, A Cultural History. Sociologist Laura Carpenter teaches at Vanderbilt University in the US and is author of Virginity Lost, an intimate portrait of first sexual experiences. These are very short descriptions of their extensive bodies of work, which I urge you to seek out in bookstores and online. You can find links through womenlikesex.com, episode 14. And with that, let's begin. I am really curious as to when we began placing such emphasis on virginity, because I can't imagine our earliest ancestors really placed that much emphasis on the first time that they had intercourse.
If that's how you define virginity loss.
Exactly. I already fell into the trap. And I will say that, Laura, you blew my mind. So I met Laura in 2019. Laura said something about virginity is a social construct. And I was like, what? Oh my God, of course it is. Yeah, I could talk about my own ignorance for a long time, but I'd love to know when humans started, especially in the Western world, because both of you really have, your research focuses on the West, right? On the global North.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Laura, if you have a date to hand. My specialism starts sort of in the Middle Ages, around the 12th century. I'm sort of late Middle Ages onwards. You know, we're talking at least 800 years or more where we have records that show with the coming of Christianity, virginity really takes off because it becomes the most important or the most valued identity.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true for Rome, for the Roman Empire, but female purity is very important. It can be to do with religion, but it can also be to do with property and with wanting to control certainty around who your offspring are. And that's often linked to property or class or both of those things, or racial purity or national purity or whatever other constructs you want to bring in. Virginity can be linked to those as an important defense against impurity, however you want to define that.
My understanding is even longer than that. As a social construct, the sort of boundaries of the concept or the framing of the concept changes. But the idea that it would be important to think about, particularly, I will say females, not women or girls, not having had an experience through which they could reproduce before they had sex with whoever was going to be passing down property. Were matrilineal societies different? Maybe. I don't know that anyone knows.
Oh, good question. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
It is the sex that can get pregnant and give birth, I think, is one of the reasons for the focus, although certainly male virginity or male chastity, as Anke demonstrates, not the same thing, right? Chastity, purity, virginity, we use them synonymously, but one could be not a virgin but be chaste.
What inspired you, respectively, as a historian and a sociologist, to study virginity?
The official story is when I was in graduate school in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, I was really interested in gender and sexuality, particularly sexual activity, and interested in cultural meanings. And at the time, in the mid 90s, there were suddenly burst forth all of this coverage of secondary virginity, and young people. I mean, there was a big cover on Newsweek, I think it was, Born Again Virgins. My first reaction was, I worked so hard to get rid of that. Why would I want another one? Which really got me thinking, what's going on? And how women's sexuality, men's sexuality, straight sexuality, gay sexuality, like how diverse the ideas are. What is this about? Why do we have sex? Is it good, bad? For who is it good, bad for? So I got really interested in sort of virginity and virginity loss as a case for thinking about how people come to absorb and act on different understandings of a phenomenon like virginity or virginity loss. The less official version, which I talk about a little bit in the book, is that my own sexual coming of age was a controversial issue in my family. I'm the kid of a single mother who was religious, but really liberal Christian religious. But my mother thought women's virginity was a big deal. That I did not think it was a big deal was a source of conflict in my youth. So I dedicated the book to my mom, and she proudly displayed it.
That's so interesting because I recognize so much of that, but it's like it's flipped on its head for me. So virginity was not something I'd ever thought about really in terms of my own life. It wasn't something that was around in the cultures that I grew up in or the countries I grew up in, Germany or in Britain, or at least not the circles I was familiar with. But I was studying medieval culture and literature, which I never expected to do. I went to university to just study literature. And then I thought, let's try this medieval stuff. I've never done that. And I got completely hooked, mainly because of someone who taught me at the time, who was really into feminist theory, and just it blew my mind, with both a theory and then thinking about this long ago period in light of very contemporary ideas around identity, subjectivity, gender, and sexuality. And then I came across virgin martyr narratives, which are, really well known. And they often featured young women who were just allowed to act in ways that other women of the period that we know of were not allowed to act. They were outspoken, they were rude, they were courageous, and there were lots of problematic elements, especially the violence to those stories is deeply problematic. But nonetheless, it sort of raised the question for me, what difference does it make? Why does virginity license them to act in ways and be in ways that they normally, the culture just wouldn't allow, just would forbid or would be very disapproving about? Was virginity a different kind of gender, that's sort of a third gender almost in the period, or not, was what I was interested in looking at. Then later on, when I worked on the book, then I became really aware of a lot of those purity movements and things that Laura is talking about. And it made me look back on my younger teenage years. Because of my father's job, we moved a lot, and I went to international schools that were predominantly American. I suddenly saw that this had been part of the discourse in those contexts, even if it wasn't maybe always overt, it was there. And or those assumptions about how young women should act or shouldn't act, that they were just so powerful, even if they were unspoken. People just knew.
Right.
And then it made me think about the more contemporary settings and how that shaped my own self-understanding. So I came at it almost through the Middle Ages.
So when you teach or have taught about virginity, all of us, I think, have a lot of certainty about what it is, especially if you are heterosexual. So much of the definitions of sex are heteronormative. But how quickly do people become confused, or how quickly do you pull the rug out from under them?
I haven't worked on virginity for a while, so this might have changed, obviously. But when I was doing it into the around 2010 up to 2010 or beyond, I was always surprised that the things that I found really fascinating, that it wasn't clearly defined, that it wasn't a physical condition, that really upset people. I mean, not everyone, but there would always be someone in the group, including in academic context, who would get quite upset about that and would not find it interesting, but would find it either upsetting or enraging for various different reasons, their own personal histories or family histories, or because it's something they believed in very strongly. And for my students, it was part of a course about different kind of sexual and gender identities in the Middle Ages, but this was a topic that just got attention in a way that the others didn't. Whatever people felt about it or thought about it, they found it a sort of a hook on which they could then hang their own experience or something they wanted to know more about or wanted to talk about in the seminar that was not just academic.
Upset and enraged with you, or more broadly because you were taking a calcified notion and taking a sledgehammer to it?
It was hard to tell sometimes because sometimes people just storm off or they would ask really hostile questions and then would disappear. So it wasn't a conversation that I could pursue. And sometimes people got enraged because they suddenly saw the concept in a different light and maybe had been raised a certain way and found that very upsetting and enraging. But yeah, I think for some people it was just shocking. It sort of split open a worldview, and that was too much. And then people would leave. I think that's why they left anyway.
I see you nodding, Laura. So I imagine you had similar experiences. But I just want to ask, was there a difference between how males and females reacted?
I would get some hostility from men in the audience, or males in the audience rather, but it was more veiled maybe. And whereas the reactions I got from females were more raw, and that was often both in the positive and maybe the more conflicted sense.
I get similar reactions to my research about battles over male circumcision.
Yeah.
People are very intense. With virginity and virginity loss, when I was interviewing people, the first question I opened with is, if you had to define or describe virginity to a visitor from another planet, what would you tell them? Sometimes that would get into adjudicating body parts, and sometimes it wouldn't, or they would say something, if a person said the first time you have sex is virginity loss, I'm like, what would entail the first time of having sex? The LGBTQ people I interviewed, they often would open with, but what is sex? And then would get into that spontaneously. And for heterosexual women and men I interviewed, I had to ask, usually. Although a lot of people had thought about oral sex and anal sex and whether they, quote unquote, counted as virginity losers. Or I asked people explicitly about sexual assault. Some people, like, that blew their, and either they had thought about that as a form of violence and not sex, or they were, it's so sad, but of course that would be losing your virginity. So some people had these very embodied interpretations of virginity, and some people had these, I wouldn't say spiritual, right, but sort of intellectual, or, it's a certain kind of experience, not a bodily phenomenon. I was about 2/3 of the way through the data collection when the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. And what sex meant in the United States became a very, very, very hot topic. And I was afraid that that was then going to make my data very, very weird. And fortunately, most of the people I interviewed after that were identified as somewhere in the LGBTQ community. But to Anke's point, in my book, I talk about a thing I call definitional gerrymandering. I've interviewed quite a few people who said that their definition of virginity or virginity loss had changed over time, in terms of they now thought that more things counted as sex and therefore would count as virginity loss. But what they understood to be their own moment of virginity loss, they were not going to redefine. So somebody who, by the time I was interviewing them, thought that fellatio or cunnilingus was just as sex as P&V, they might define it that way now. But if they had had oral sex before vaginal sex as young people and understood the vaginal sex as the virginity loss moment, they were going to stick with that for their own biography.
To quote you, Anke, from your book, you say religion, not medicine, has been the supreme authority of virginity for nearly a millennium, while medical textbooks today don't waste much ink on it. You talked about paternity certainty, purity and virginity establishing a way to pass down property to your heirs. Can we still attribute it to that today? Can we say that it is just yet another social control over people's bodies, women's in particular? Or is that reductive and dismissive and biased on my part.
I don't think it's reductive, but I looked at the questions you sent us and I was trying to find an answer that wasn't going to take 5 hours. It was really difficult. I do think when I say religion has been historically the main arbiter, I think it's just for religion or for Christianity, which is what I mainly studied historically, is that virginity is not just a physical thing. It is primarily a spiritual condition. So it's both. It's spiritual and physical. So that is why it's all encompassing. It's so important. Whereas for medical writers or gynecological writers in the Middle Ages and earlier, it's treated as a physical condition, and therefore you do find it treated both as health-giving by some writers and as totally detrimental to health. So it's a practical problem or a practical good, and that's what they address. So for example, frottage is recommended in some medieval texts as a way of ensuring that a young virgin is able to get rid of these humors that were believed to build up in the body, but they need to be expelled in order for the body to stay healthy. So what do? You encourage rubbing of the clitoris or something so that they can be expelled. And that's fine. That's not seen as a problem. Now, for religious writers, it becomes much more complicated. And so I think the inheritance of that combination of medical, political, or practical inheritance, if you want to think about it, and spiritual, that is what makes it both such a flexible concept, which can change across time and morph into different, shapeshift a little bit, but keeps it generally recognizable that people at least feel they know what it means and what we're referring to. Even though there has been quite a lot written, especially in more recent years, maybe about how it's an individual definition. So for me, this is what virginity loss might mean or not mean. I think it's also difficult to say it can just ever be that individual definition, because you're, of course, operating within a wider culture that may or may not have very big investments in virginity as a concept. One of the most cherished narratives of Western modernity, which is a belief in linear progress, is not how it works. So we see across history that it becomes more or differently important at different times, and it responding to a whole set of other priorities. So women's bodies, because I'm thinking mainly about female virginity as what's considered important, stand in for so many other ideals or worries or concerns politically,
right,
that it's always of social and political interest. So it becomes something that is tied up with nationalism, with racial purity. So virginity is just tied to so many other ideals that it gets hitched to, because women's bodies represent in patriarchal cultures the ability to keep something pure and safe and under control.
There is no biological medical definition of virginity tied in general, but especially not tied to the hymen. And yet we hold on to this belief that that is when you have P and V or anything in V, that the hymen will be quote unquote broken. What are some ways in the past that they had of testing, proving, in heavy air quotes, virginity in females? And were there any corresponding tests or evidence in males?
In the sources I'm familiar with from the Middle Ages and before, it's not really the hymen that is mentioned. And in fact, the reliability of the hymen or any sign, physical sign of virginity, is recognized to be just non-existent, really, from very early on, from the late Middle Ages or 16th, 17th century. You get writers already saying this hymen thing, it's not that reliable, although others will maintain it absolutely is reliable. So you get those two sides. So before the hymen becomes the thing, blood is very important. So it's not that people necessarily believe there is a membrane that is imperforate and it will suddenly be broken, like a seal, that's broken. But they believe that a virgin body, maybe also because virgins are usually, if they're going to go on and become sexual rather than lifelong virgins, are younger, prepubescent or early pubescent, that they're narrower. It's believed they haven't been opened up, quote unquote, a terrible kind of image. But this idea that penetrative sexual intercourse opens up the passageways, if you like. And that is why they bleed. And that's why blood is very, very important. But then you do get other, I think I mentioned in the book that, sort of virgins make a different sound when they urinate. It's more of a higher hissing sound. Again, presumably because the passages are narrower, or they blush, or they walk a certain way, or their breasts are shaped a certain way, or the uterus is harder and firmer, or their pubic hair is less curly or more curly. There's almost like a sort of desperation to find the proof. There is an acknowledgement, even if it's unspoken, that it's actually very, very difficult to ever prove unequivocally. And that also feeds into two other ideas that are really important. One is a belief that women are not really very trustworthy. So women will dissimulate. So they might fake virginity. And then also the idea that if spiritual virginity is actually really important, and loss of virginity can begin not in the body, but in the mind, because you're already lascivious, you're already sinful because of your imagination or your desires, then how do you prove virginity? Because, then you're going into a whole other territory of wanting to read somebody's soul. If you need that certainty, you want it in the soul as well as in the body, and you're not getting it in either place, really. And that drives people a bit crazy, I think.
You can't win with female sexuality. So often you cannot win.
No.
Then if you move it into spirituality, you're basically asking someone to prove a negative all the time.
Well, in that sense, it's not unlike what's expected sometimes in cases of sexual violence, that you have to perform a certain way to persuade people that you have really been violated and experienced it as a violation, rather than being complicit in some way. And I think that's definitely what you find very early on as well, that already there's this idea that if, virginity is taken violently through rape, for example, that the conditions required in order to prove that that is what really happened are so difficult to fulfill that it's almost impossible for a female to prove that.
It's an ever shifting, it's playground politics.
Yeah, it's really hard. You asked earlier about male virginity, and I think it's just, even though it is important in some identities to be celibate or abstinent, for example, if you're religious, if you're clergy, if you're a monk, for example, celibacy and abstinence and chastity are not the same as virginity. And I just don't see, in my experience, at least, I don't know if Laura has other examples from her research, I just do not see an equivalent concern. And I don't see an equivalent list of how can you tell. There was certainly a lot of anxiety around monks who were not chaste and that they would pollute the altar. That was a serious matter. So it's not like it wasn't serious. But you didn't have the virginity test as you did for female virginity.
The lists of it's this sign or this sign or this sign or this sign remind me of tests for witchcraft also.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in this sort of thinking about chastity as opposed to virginity, and why like a state of never having been sexually touched or being sexually pure from the get-go would be so important in relation to women, but current chastity for men in those roles that would matter. It never struck me that men having never had sex was so important, but they were chaste while they were a monk, while they were a priest. They had repudiated those sins or so forth. But one thing I got really interested in is how much becoming sexually active or virginity loss, depending on how you slice the cake, is treated like an on-off switch, right? And then something irrevocably changes then, which was sort of one of the reasons that secondary virginity or born-again virginity became so interesting, because it was then you could, if not physically, then psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, put the switch back in the other direction, right? But the idea that you would, by crossing that threshold, be permanently altered somehow is really interesting and relates to other kinds of first times or role transit. So sociologists would talk about role transitions. Anthropologists would talk about rites of passage. Having your first child makes you a parent. Having your second child makes you busier. Losing your virginity makes you not a virgin, or makes you quote unquote sexually active, even if you're not actively having much sex. But having a second sexual partner, I mean, there are other meanings attached too, but you might be a slut now.
Oh, yeah.
Even in the Middle Ages, there was this idea that if a nun, for example, was raped during war, that it didn't count, and that it was spiritual virginity that was the most important thing, more than physical virginity, because they were spiritually pure, and it was a violation rather than something they conceded to. But then again, how do you prove that you didn't really enjoy it actually, or didn't agree to it? The theory kind of was there that virginity could be something that was more self-determined or something more interior as well. But ultimately, I think it really did always come back down to the body.
To go back to male virginity, one thing I was thinking about, how absurd that would seem to most people if there were, when you were talking matrilineal cultures, if there were a culture in which mothers took their daughters to a male sex worker. This is a rite of passage. You need to be good at this for your partner. It's science fiction, right? It sounds like some kind of sci-fi or alternate reality.
It's making me want to rewrite the myth of the vaginal orgasm, or Gloria Steinem's "If Men Could Menstruate," but thinking about, what would the tests be? On a more serious note, and thinking in relation to violence and gendered violence in particular, remaining a virgin is one of the complaints of a lot of incels, of the radicalized involuntary celibate online community.
The term itself, which they've appropriated. I know it began with a woman in the 90s. It was different, but
yeah,
to use that is to then say any one of us who goes through a period where we're not getting the sexy time we wish we were getting is involuntarily celibate.
Yeah.
The idea that something is owed to you, that you are entitled to something, is profoundly dangerous.
But you could imagine, say, then the virginity markers for men would be, he looks the particular way.
His penis droops to the left or to the right. His testicles are smaller or too small, too big.
Things that appear unmanly. He's shy. I mean, you could imagine this similar list.
You do have earlier cultures as well, where being masculine in a sexual situation was about being the so-called active partner. So in a way, if you weren't the active partner, you were taking up a feminized position, which I don't know if that then meant that virginity became something that could apply in those situations for men who were being penetrated, for example. Was that then understood as virginity loss? But I'm not aware that it was explicitly written about in those terms. And this is why, of course, it's also problematic. Definitions of heterosexual intercourse, where the proper woman's role is also carefully defined, because the female is not meant to do certain things.
Right.
So there's only certain positions, or there's only certain things that officially, at least, ideally, you are meant to do if you're going to be properly female in that role.
You are damned if you do have sex, whatever that is, as a female, right? And damned if you don't, as a male.
I think it's probably, at least since the 60s, in countries like the United States anyway, it's not that women should never have sex, because that's problematic too. But we want them to have sex when they have sex in specific kinds of conditions. I mean, there wouldn't be so many, like, the crazy kids are out to lose their virginity movies, where that's a goal, and it's a goal for boys and girls in those movies, young men and young women. People don't want their kids to become sexually active too young, but they also start worrying about them if they haven't had. Lots of people find asexuality as an identity really kind of even more disturbing somehow.
As far as I'm aware, some people feel positively about both terms being used, whereas some people really don't see virginity as having too much historical and cultural baggage, and asexuality as being quite distinct and different from virginity. So there's an interesting question around definitions there as well that happens with asexuality. And I think for virginity is also an argument that is made that it was something that allowed women in particular to get out of certain cultural expectations. I mean, the early Christianity was a radical identity. It was about saying, your main allegiance, it is not to your father, it is not to your family, it is not to your husband, it is to Christ. That was so radical socially, because it's saying the social contract, the way that politics is structured, society, we're going to redefine it. Christianity has the power to redefine what relationships like lover, husband, wife means. So virginity was actually always also a potentially threatening identity. And I think we see that virginity always verges on being dangerous, especially if it's maintained in a culture that doesn't think it ought to be maintained, whether that's Protestant early modern culture that believes marriage is the natural end state for everyone, or maybe even today in some ways where, as Laura said, it's seen as something that people maybe want to rid themselves of. Or, for example, suffragettes or women's rights activists were often labeled I talk about in the book, virgint, which was meant to be about a masculinized woman who's unnatural because of what she wants for other women, the rights she wants. She wants men's prerogatives, and that shows that there's an unnaturalness. And virginity always had that potential because it didn't fit neatly, which is why there was so much energy expended in the High Middle Ages on making virginity feminized. The Virgin Mary, that is virginity, not the martial warrior Amazon. No, that's not what we want quite. We want, sweet, obedient humility.
And a child.
Difficult for many people to do both those things.
Yeah.
And not a lesbian.
Yeah.
That's sort of an interesting discussion and has been a historic thing, right? Like the term used to be like gold star lesbians, right? Women who had never had sex with men, but had had sex with women. Were they virgins? Were they not virgins? Is that term even relevant? People certainly have different opinions about that. But women living their lives outside the framework of anything related to men, pretty threatening to the modern social, the contemporary social order as well.
I do like the idea of it also being a silver lining for women. Like, I don't want to be a wife. I don't want to be a mother, which were the roles that society prescribed for them. So you're like, no, I'm sorry, honey, like not tonight. I'm thinking about Christ.
That's why Christ was presented by some religious writers as the ideal husband. It was like, look, your husband's going to beat you. Your husband's going to make you do drudgery and housework. You're going to be pregnant all the time. You're going to be, you're going to feel terrible. You're going to be tired, and you have this horrible lout who's going to expect things of you. Christ doesn't do any of those things. It's much better.
It's much better. It's non-penetrative penetration, spiritual penetration. Religious people are probably going to be horrified that I said that, but
no, not in the Middle Ages, because you get these women visionaries who have these incredibly erotic, what we would consider erotic fantasies of Christ, coming them and licking his wounds, or, it's very physical. But I think what Laura says is also really important, actually, historically, the idea that what women did with other women, it wasn't thought to threaten the order of things.
Because women aren't penetrating, or in theory are not penetrating each other or being penetrated. That is what my understanding is to be historically, and even now, why we consider that less threatening than male homosexuality.
Yes, and if you're thinking about it in a kind of non-religious context, secular context, it doesn't lead to unwanted pregnancy. It doesn't lead to confusion around paternity, those kinds of issues. So those things are all still intact and not threatened. I mean, I think in a religious context, it would be seen as problematic simply because desire was problematic. So whatever the object of your desire, if it wasn't God or Christ, then that is problematic. So that's where the spiritual side comes in. And that makes it so much more, all encompassing, doesn't it? If it becomes your inner world, as well as what you do, you're having to police both those things. So that's, those contexts were different, the secular and the more religious. Yeah.
To segue from there to Laura, to your work, in your book, you have 3 main categories of virginity losers. Virginity loss are the stigmatized, the rite of passage, or those who see it as a rite of passage, and the gifters. Can you explain that?
I became really struck by the ways that people used different metaphors to talk about virginity. And then depending on what metaphor they used to understand virginity, that typically influenced the kinds of decisions they made about sexual activity, and particularly beginning sexual activity. So one group of people thought about virginity as a special gift that you would give to somebody that you loved in return, not necessarily for the other person's virginity, but for more commitment, affection, more intimacy, and so forth, and that would be an ongoing reciprocal gift relationship. And sometimes they were religious and sometimes they weren't. Other people saw virginity as just a hideous stigma that they needed to get rid of as soon as possible. So the gifters tended to attempt to have sex with people that they loved, right? And were in relationships with, and tended to think about contraception if they were heterosexual. Although for women, that can suggest you were thinking too much about sex. And maybe that was, so it would get complicated that way. For people who saw virginity as a stigma, all that mattered was not being a virgin anymore. And so who you had sex with didn't matter so much. Even if you enjoyed it or not, didn't matter so much. It was just that you didn't have to have that identity anymore. Then the people who spoke about virginity and virginity loss as like a step in growing up like a rite of passage or just part of gaining knowledge, where they were sort of more motivated by curiosity. This is something that's going to happen at some point. There's really no pressure. I don't really need to love the person. I just want to kind of find out what's going on. They tended to be much more flexible. And a lot of the LGBTQ people I interviewed actually were in that category, partly because I think coming out was so related to becoming sexually active for them. They were the most resilient if their first experiences weren't particularly pleasant. They're like, oh, well, we're going to learn some more. Whereas the stigmatized people, particularly men, if it didn't go well, got very, very embarrassed. And particularly if they got called out as a virgin. It was sort of more acceptable for a woman.
Right.
She might think her virginity was a stigma, but other people didn't necessarily. So, and I should back up. Women and men who favored the same metaphor actually made pretty similar decisions and wanted pretty similar things. Women were more likely to see virginity as a gift. Men were more likely to see it as a stigma. But men who saw virginity as a gift made a lot of the same decisions women did. But the women, if they were abandoned by that partner or the relationship ended mutually, tended to feel like they had lost something important because that gift was now not in their lives. And then I interviewed a couple of people who saw maintaining virginity as part of their commitment to God. I mean, I did most of the research in the Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. area, and almost everybody I interviewed, if they had a religious background, either came from Christian or Jewish backgrounds. Going back, I would interview people from, I think, try to find some Muslim Americans to interview and people from other kinds of religious backgrounds as well. And frankly, it was just not the U.S. South.
Right.
Where even at the time, purity culture was, I think, starting to take hold.
Did you find differences, and I know that in your work as well, Anke, that you studied cultural differences, like among racial and ethnic lines?
It wasn't so much the meaning of virginity, and I don't want to make claims too strong. About a quarter of the people I interviewed identified as something other than white, but then the groups within were relatively small. It was sort of these extra meanings attached. So for the African American women I interviewed in particular were really navigating at the same time they were navigating ideas about virginity and virginity loss. They were navigating respectability politics and stereotypes about Black women's sexuality and Black women being sexually voracious or sexually available. A couple Latinas I interviewed, and again, a very small sample, Lorena Garcia's work on Puerto Rican and Mexican American young women thinking about first sex, would be much more informative that way. But the Latinas I interviewed had, and the Latinos for that matter, for the men, spoke of cultural attitudes about virginity and particularly women's virginity as being sort of a distinctive part of, family belief, heritage culture related to Roman Catholicism.
A lot depended on class historically. So even within a relatively homogenous kind of society, depending on, were you aristocrat? Were you a milkmaid? Things mattered more or less, not from arguably a religious point of view, but maybe there too, but certainly from a secular point of view. If you had no family inheritance to pass down, does your virginity matter as much? And we do know that people lost their virginity before getting married, and that was in some cases considered perfectly reasonable and acceptable, not least in order to find out if your future wife was able to get pregnant. That might be one thing, but also for financial reasons or practical reasons, it didn't always mean that sex happened after marriage. And I think as the Middle Ages go on, the church definitely tries to grab hold of that narrative more, and it does that in part by valorizing marriage. So marriage becomes a spiritual sacrament, but then you also get a narrative around mutual desire and mutual love and willingness to get married. You shouldn't be forced by your family. Again, what happens in practice is another matter. With Protestantism, that changes again because marriage becomes the most natural state, if you like, and valorized as such, or the more normal state that everyone should aspire to, especially also women, because childbearing is what matters. So I think class really matters. And then you get, in terms of colonization, what you get is earlier versions of what Laura talks about. So the fetishization of women in countries that are being colonized or being invaded, seen as particularly desirable or sexually lascivious. But also you get those countries and territories themselves being defined as virginal. even though there are inhabitants there, they haven't been conquered by a Christian army, makes them like a virgin that hasn't got the right bridegroom or is unmanned, is a word that was used sometimes.
Yeah.
And so it's an open invitation, because if you're going to frame it in those terms, everyone knows if you live in a culture that a young virgin needs to be married off or needs to belong to someone, then that territory becomes also fair game. And in fact, that's a decent thing to do. If you want to push it to its logical extreme, it's the right thing to do, because that virgin territory needs a good husband.
Hasn't met the right man. Needs the right man to, Jesus, yeah. One of the things that I asked you in the questions was, is it fair to say that virginity is one of the greatest myths about sexuality in general and female sexuality in particular? But now you've broadened my horizons. It's one of the greatest myths of humanity in general. And we've used it to alibi so much. Is it fair to say that it's one of our greatest myths? I mean, the personal is political, but it underlies global politics as well.
I think what's interesting is just the sheer persistence and endurance. If we look at, in 2018, I think it was, the World Health Organization said that 20 countries globally that they were aware of were practicing, virginity testing and so-called virginity repair surgery, and that it should be forbidden. It wasn't until 2022 in the UK that those things were made illegal. When my book came out, which is a while ago now, I remember a theater producer inviting me to London, and there was a play that they'd put on about virginity. And afterwards, it was me and also a medical professional who performed so-called hymen repair, and we were meant to be having this debate. And I remember being incredulous and fascinated also in a kind of rather gruesome way, I guess, about how that was going to be justified and explained. But I think it's still legal in the US, if I'm right.
I believe it is, Laura.
Yeah. So far as I know, I mean, in the United States, you can have almost anything done for any reason whatsoever if you can pay for it and you're not a minor.
At the theater, how did that discussion go?
I found it very uncomfortable. And the argument that was brought up, people always wanted to, when the book came out, they always wanted to talk about other cultures. And what they meant by that was Muslim culture at the time. I explicitly said this is about Western culture because that's what I know about, but that's what everyone wanted to talk about. And so the argument around hymen repair was it's an act of accepting cultural difference, and it's an act where we actually protect women. And I also felt, you have hymenoplasty that's advertised by surgeries as a matter of choice for women, and then it's couched in capitalist kind of pro-choice consumer terms. So a woman who chooses that is empowered and is, whereas women from other cultures, we have to do it to help them, you see, because their cultures are backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's the same procedure. So I felt that, it was in many ways a tense, for me, a not satisfying conversation.
And that same medical professional could use that energy into telling patients or the parents of patients, if they are going from the perspective of protecting someone, this is not a thing.
That's what we said to him. We said, but you're continuing the idea that this is a thing when it's not a thing. So you are actually continuing the narrative, whereas we know it's not a thing. You're giving it your authority as a medical professional.
I found counterfeit maidenheads.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of ways to get around.
What are those?
Oh, like a little baggie of blood that you insert that'll bleed when... but some of the virginity restoring surgeries are also really just putting a couple of stitches in the hymen so that there will be blood, presumably when somebody, has penetrative sex, but it depends on how big the thing penetrates, right? Like these other factors. A friend of mine actually managed to demonstrate her so-called virginity in a rural village setting where it mattered because she was having her period when she and her husband got married, and so they were able to hang out a sheet as expected.
Wow.
And this was in the early 2000s.
I have met somebody mid to late 30s, early 40s, talking about how she thought that the hymen was you, as you were talking about Anke before, a seal that somehow, and she always wondered, how is it that my pee can get out but not this, so the seal has got to be somewhere else, even though she couldn't see it in a mirror, but was convinced.
For something that is, essentially made up to be something that so many people have been so concerned about. I mean, as Anke said, the durable concern in different ways, right? The content sort of shifts, but the form remains, is fascinating. Also, there was some concern about a myth going around in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and I think some other Southeast Asian countries possibly as well, that having sex with a virgin would protect from HIV. And I know the World Health Organization and some other NGOs were sort of on the ground trying to combat those myths. So the idea that virgins are somehow magical also. It wasn't just the idea that having sex with somebody who hadn't had a certain kind of sex before would be pure and therefore not liable to transmit disease, but that in fact could be curative because virgins are special and can pet unicorns.
The virginal sacrifice.
There's another fun myth or story.
Humans and gods want virgins. Everybody wants virgins.
That always fascinated me, though. Don't you want a sexual partner who knows what they're doing? Or not, right? So if she's a virgin, she can't tell if I don't know what I'm doing, or if I'm not very good, or if my penis is small and funny shaped.
So much of what we do traces back to what a bunch of men from thousands of years ago deemed to be natural, the natural order of things.
Yeah, but women police each other's virginity.
But the rules were set, and it wasn't only men, but it was predominantly men. But yeah, no, women police each other all the time.
It's so often that it's not about even the individual bodies that are being policed, but about what their policing proves about the people doing the policing. Mm-hmm. So if you take a medieval example, the Gregorian reform in the 11th century said, we're going to have clerical celibacy, and that's for men as well as women. And a lot of priests were not happy about this because they were married. But the church was like, no, to shore up our authority, to show that we are different from the normal run of people. In order to have the spiritual authority, we need to be different. And so celibacy and abstinence and virginity for nuns or whatever is part of that. In a way, then individual people's bodies, either they cement relations. So, for example, if the father gives the bride to the husband, it cements relations between two men, the woman's body that's being passed across. Or it's about an institution and the power of that institution, or the power of the family, the power of the father of the family to control his women, his wife and daughters. It's often not even about the body in question. That body almost disappears. It then becomes about what the people who are doing the controlling want to say and how they want to portray themselves.
Or humiliating and dishonoring. One man doing it to another over the body of a woman.
To some extent, we might also think about purity culture or guarding one's child's, daughter, or even son's virginity as being a lot about demonstrating a certain kind of parenthood or a certain kind of piety in the religious identity in the parent.
Yeah.
And not to discount that parents of all kinds of beliefs aren't making choices because they are concerned about their child, but that also guarding your daughter's virginity is a way of demonstrating that you're a good mother or a good father or a good parent or a religious person, devout as well.
When I started hearing about the purity balls, where you dress up these little girls to look like they're women to then pledge to their fathers that they will be little girls whose sexuality can be guarded by their father, is, especially when they're that young, it has to be about the parents.
Everybody thinks their other kids are, but not their own kids. Sociologist Seneca Elliott actually has this great thing. She interviewed parents and their kids, their teenagers, about sex ed. The parents either invariably would say things like, other kids are out there doing whatever, but my kid is either not interested in that yet or is very responsible, or my stepkid is a sexual demon. Watch out. Stepkids, they understood totally differently than their own kids often. But also virginity loss. Why loss? I tried to get people to talk about the loss thing because I thought, why use this language of loss instead of sexual something?
When we travel abroad for the first time, we don't consider it, we're not losing.
It's my parochial loss.
Yeah, my parochial loss, my hometown loss. Is it sexual gain? Is it that doesn't sound quite like something, it's got to be pithier.
Yeah. You know, the people who saw virginity loss as a step in a growing up or a process were at least in that kind of the framework. You know, you're learning things. This is exploring it's new experiences. Or if they were losing something, it was lack of experience, or they were losing ignorance about some non-knowledge, right? But very few people I spoke to found the term loss as vexing as I did, but I do find it vexing.
You haven't lost something, you have gained something. That doesn't mean it's, it's always a great gain, but it's just it's the first time you're going to do something, hopefully many, many more times in your life. And as momentous as we build it up to be, it's usually like the worst sex you're going to have because you just don't know what you're doing, regardless of what age you are. Everything takes experience and some knowledge, and especially about your own body.
Though it may depend, right? If you've had a lot of other kinds of sexual experience,
that's true.
Sometimes it's sort of the, with a specific partner can also help because you've figured stuff out. But I honestly think if, we're thinking, again, it's how you define virginity loss.
I still don't know if I'm going to call the episode, How Can You Lose Something You Don't Have, or Something That Doesn't Exist?
And yet the things we believe are real in their consequences, even if there is no really a virginity, people believe there is one. It matters. It's socially consequential. Race may not exist, but people act like it is and does. And so it has consequences in people's lives.
The consequences for people are very, very real. And have been, throughout history. And that's why sometimes I think it's a point we made at the start, that you can have a personal definition of what, if anything, virginity means to you, but within a certain cultural context, you don't fully get to control that narrative.
I think if you just substituted the word God for virginity, it would make sense, in the sense that virginity is faith-based, right? You have to believe in it, and in something that you can't ostensibly prove.
I thought your final question about, did we think things had changed since we wrote initially about this? I just really wanted to hear Laura's.
I would love to know.
So yes and no. I think there's been much more of a conversation about what sex means, how people define sex. So I think there's been some more public conversation about that. I think the emphasis on purity, if anything, did increase for some populations, even as it decreased for others. I think young people apparently are having sex a bit later. They're also not getting driver's licenses, like at the same rates as kids did 20, 30, 40 years ago. But in other ways, I talk to young people, or I know people, friends or other people I know have assigned my work, and I think, oh, but it's ancient. But then people say, oh yeah, this sounds right. These metaphors are still there and shaping people's thoughts and behaviors and so forth, right? Those have not gone away, although remains to be seen what happens, of course, with some of the current political stuff going on around gender and sex, like biological sex and sexuality and those definitions. But, if you had interviewed me 5 years ago, I would have said, actually, everybody's a lot more open to ideas about the complexity of gender and the complexity of biological sex, and sort of thinking about different kinds of bodies doing different things with one another. And, that maybe this sort of moment where we understand, but the idea that we have this sort of one moment where people become sexually active or become sexual, when it really is a process for most people in some ways or another.
And Anke, are there things in the last 20 years of your own work and research and just social changes that you've seen that could have possibly informed your book in a different way?
Oh, I think definitely. Even just thinking about sort of popular culture or social media or just ways of communicating, and the things that Laura said, I mean, that would open up whole things that I didn't look at. And even at the time, there were things I couldn't look at because the book had to be a certain size and not, my own research has moved away from that. And I sort of work a lot on environmental things now instead, even though it seems to come back at me. So I work on mosses a lot, and apparently they were considered suitable objects for study for young women in the Victorian period because they were thought to reproduce asexually and be virginal. But it did also strike me that, yeah, in some ways what's disheartening is it feels like it's still so recognizable, I think. Someone once asked me if I saw a positive use or of virginity or of the concept. I feel like there might be positive uses for individuals, the way they shape their own narrative and their identity, that I wouldn't want to take away from. But for me, I don't see it as a concept, as something that can ever be disentangled from the really negative understandings that underpin it, really.
Trying to grasp at some, again, silver lining straws, some positive straws. If you're thinking of saving yourself for someone, that it can help as a deterrent to sexual violence, because we know that so many people's sexual experiences in general, but especially early sexual experiences, are actually violence. They're not sex. But if you're thinking of it as something that you are giving to someone, that you're going to perhaps be more protected from coercion, since most sexual violence is coercion, you will be possibly more in control of your sexuality, of your body.
Wish that were the case. As you were talking, I was thinking about a couple of the saddest, most disturbing stories I heard when I was interviewing people. Were women who were coerced into giving that gift to a coercive boyfriend who felt he deserved it, or who were treated horribly for not being virgins, or a woman who, gave that gift to somebody who ended up being an abusive husband and took longer to leave him because he had that she valued, that part of her, as she described it. If I had one piece of advice coming out of that research for ordinary, everyday people, have sex with somebody you like. That sounds so simple and so silly to even say it, but you might love somebody but not like them, or you might just be trying to get it over with and not even know the person. And that can be fun. I'm not going to condemn casual sex, and I'm not going to condemn sex between people who only had sex with each other and are in love, but liking the person, seems to actually, in terms of people's pleasure, it matters. In terms of people's comfort with things didn't go exactly as planned, in terms of people feeling okay about saying, hey, can we use a condom?
Yeah.
Or a diaphragm? I mean, that just seems to matter so much more than any of it.
We should be teaching that sex ed it's not going to happen in schools, but hopefully in families, at home, or whoever is talking to kids personally, that sex is fun and joyous, all the things that are sex. Because if you can help kids from an early age understand that it's fun, that when a situation is not fun, regardless of what it is, even if they don't understand fully why it's not fun, or that they're being coerced, or that the gut reaction can be like, oh, this isn't fun, this isn't sex, this is something else, so I have to go, or you have to go. Or
I think the fear, right, the social fear of telling, there's the assumption also that everybody somehow, they already either know that sex is fun and therefore they're going to, that heaven forbid my kids know that sex is like supposed to be enjoyable, so they're going to go try to have it right now. That doesn't seem to actually be borne out in fact. But I really like, though, what you said about if something feels wrong here, this is actually supposed to feel good emotionally, physically, various combinations of that. And if it doesn't, that's a bad sign.
One of your interviewees was a young man who was coerced into intercourse, into P&V, by a woman. And I really appreciated that was in there, because every single person is capable of sexual violence. And so anytime you're pressuring anyone, you can't just take somebody's body from them. But the flip side of that is understanding that it's fun, that it should just feel good.
Some of the fun is actually in it's not perfect.
That's another one of virginity's terrible myths, isn't it? That if it is the gift, for example, or if you wait for the right person, that it will be great. And then you think, well, what happens to people who really believe that and who have then given this gift and it's not fun and it doesn't feel right, or it's, whatever? Can you then even afford to be honest about it? Because so much is invested in this idea that this was meant to be the thing. The gift thing, I thought that was so helpful, Laura's work on that. And I thought there's so much darkness around that idea, that it seems empowering in some ways and positive, but really, does it suggest that once again, it goes back to loss, when you don't have that gift anymore, then what? If you thought it gave you that power, if you like, of the bestowing of the gift, but you no longer have that gift, then do you then perceive that as a diminished position for yourself, especially if that relationship doesn't last? Again, I always feel like there's these, even in the positive narratives, there's this other side. I get asked by parents sometimes who've said, well, if it allows my daughter, it's usually a daughter, but sometimes a son, to say no and resist pressure, isn't that important? And I do think that's important. And that goes back to what you were both saying about things feeling right. And, so it's not, if you can be critical about the concept of virginity without ignoring the fact that some people feel there's not a whole lot of narrative out there if they want to say no. Either they don't want to be sexually active, or they don't want to be sexually active in that moment, that they don't have a language for that is socially acceptable.
Yeah, maybe to remove the capital G from gift, of the sense that every time you give your body to someone, you are gifting it. Thank you both for your time and for this lovely conversation. Difficult and painful at times, but also lovely, and for the work that you've done.
Thank you for having us. Anke, what a treat to meet you.
What a treat to meet you. I've really enjoyed your work so much.
Likewise.
So, when I got the email, I thought, yes, this is great.
Me too.
Thank you, Natasha. I really, really enjoyed it.
I'm very thankful to historian Anke Bernau and sociologist Laura Carpenter for educating us on this social construct that is virginity, its history, and some of its many consequences. You can find links to their works and books and a transcript of this conversation at womenlikesex.com on the episodes page, episode 14. Women Like Sex is a flipped script production. It is executive produced and edited by me, Natasha Stojanovic. Website design and artwork is by Ted Nunez. Edesio Martinez is associate producer. For more episodes and swag, or to subscribe to the podcast or Patreon, please visit womenlikesex.com, the Women Like Sex YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Women Like Sex. Pass it on.